Reforms are one of the three most abused terms in the last half a century. The government promulgated the laws with zero consultation, promulgated the ordinance. The corporations drafted these laws. They had managed to violate the constitution nakedly, openly. Thousands of students showed up to greet the farmers in Mumbai. And all-out denigration, vilification, criminalization of dissent. You are Khalistanis, you are this, you are that.
Hello and welcome to this very special interview. Today I have with me respected P Sainath sir. He is founding editor for People's Archive of Rural India. He has been rural reporter for decades. And it's needless to say that if you want to talk about or understand about agriculture, farmers' issues, and the current ongoing farmers' protest, it is none other than Mr. P Sainath sir. Thank you so much, sir, for agreeing to do this interview. So my first question is, how do you see the whole protest that has been happening for the past 2, 3 months now? Is it just about those three farm laws, or is it representing something else in the agriculture sector itself in this country? If a class 10th student is watching this interview and the whole episode that is happening since few months, what message does he get?
I think it appears to me that many class 10 students are ahead of their adult um, population in their sensitivity and in their need to understand the way they are reaching out to the farmers, to the protest. I think they are doing a lot better than a lot of distinguished adults. Okay. The first thing about the protests, they have been on for more than 3 months in different ways. First, a series of protests culminating in marches um, began in March 2018 when 40,000 Adivasi farmers marched from Nashik to Mumbai, 182 kilometers in 6 days and nights, over hills and valleys and highways and fields. Um, Again, that year, November 29th, farmers, not from one or two or three northern states, but from 22 states and 4 union territories, gathered outside Parliament in Delhi in a meeting which leaders of 21 political parties came onto the platform and declared their commitment to the demands and issues being raised by the farmers, many of which include the issues now. Yeah. So it isn't that these protests are out of the blue. They have a history to them. The second thing you should know is that on the issue of so-called reforms, in my opinion, uh, ref- reforms are one of the three most abused terms in the last half a century, last 30, 40 years, you could say. When anything that, when 50 years ago, we used to speak of reform in industry, yeah, reform in labor law, it used to mean improving the conditions of workers. Now the word reform of labor law means stripping the worker of any rights and allowing a kind of life and death power to the industry, to the owner, to the malik over the worker. When you spoke of labor reform, even 100 years ago, it meant the adoption of an 8-hour working day. During the pandemic lockdown, states in this country, especially those ruled by the governing party at the center, the BJP, declared 12-hour working days without, three states declared you could go up to 12 hours working days without overtime. That is, you would be paid for those additional 4 hours on a pro rata basis. What you got for the first 8 hours hourly is what you would get for the next 4 hours. So reform is a completely poisoned chalice now. Yeah. It simply means smashing the rights of ordinary people and concentrating power in the hands of corporations and the otherwise powerful. Third aspect of your question, even this protest did not begin, it began in this form 3 months ago. Yes, you could say that, almost 3 months ago. But it began right from when? In different forms, right from when the government made known its intention of promulgating these as ordinances, which it did promulgate them on June 5, 2020 as ordinances. Now, remember that the government also cancelled the entire winter session of Parliament. When the farm unions and farm leaders across the country, not just Punjab, knew that these ordinances were coming, they, at the local levels, at the level of the collectorate, at the level of state capitals, made protests and asked that nothing should be done without them being consulted. The government promulgated the laws with zero consultation, promulgated the ordinance with zero consultation. Then protests began in many, at the taluka level, at the city level, at the town level, at rural district headquarter levels, as farmers and their sympathizers demanded that these laws, that these ordinances not be taken back, not implemented, but the government introduced them in Parliament on September the 5th. So first, it did not consult, it consulted maybe a couple of its own cronies. I won't say that it consulted the corporations, because I think really the corporations drafted these laws. And one of the things, Shubham, that we need to have from this Supreme Court committee, I need them to make a declaration. They're making declarations of good intent and good faith and saying, yes, we favor the laws, but we are going to be impartial, which is a tightrope walk, which, I wish them well. But we need to know whether any of these members participated in the drafting of these laws, in which case they are obviously unsuited to be on any committee ruling over them. Did they make any inputs? Did they make any, were they consulted? Did they make any inputs? Did they participate directly or indirectly in the drafting of the laws? I think this is something we need. I think definitely it is an issue the public needs to be informed about. So then in September, when they brought it in Parliament, they had managed several incredible things. First, they had managed to violate the Constitution nakedly, openly, because in the Constitution, there are 3 lists on which legislation may happen. In the Constitution of India, in the central list, there appear the list of subjects on which only the center may legislate, maybe defense, whatever. Then appears a concurrent list. I mean,
Yeah.
in the 3 lists, on which center may legislate, state may legislate. In the event of a tug, it is usually the center's will that has prevailed. The third list is the states list, on which only the states may legislate. Agriculture is on the states list. The founders of the Constitution, this discussion took place, where agriculture should be. They very clearly concluded that it would be madness to put it on a central list in a country with India's agroecological diversities, the sheer diversity of farming from across India. Within one state of Uttar Pradesh, you could have 6 different zones, where the product, the crop, the process, the methodology, the technologies are dramatically different. The needs, the responsibilities, all are very different. They understood the chaos of trying to introduce a one size fits all law, right? So therefore, they put agriculture on the state list. The central government issued the promulgated the ordinance, consulting nobody, except maybe the corporations and maybe some of their friends on the committee presently. Two, the central government then put this in parliament without consulting parliament, without going to the or regular standard process of going to the standing committee on agriculture in parliament. They did not consult members of parliament, but just tried ramming it through. Hmm. Um, September 14th, I think it came up. Yeah, June 5 ordinances, September 14 in Parliament. Parliament members begged for a serious discussion after saying first send it to a standing committee, send it to a special committee. These are very, very serious issues. The government dismissed that thing and rammed it through Parliament. Now, when ramming it through Parliament, they resorted to a practice which has no place in the Constitution. They decided it on a voice vote. Hmm. Now, many of I'm certain your 10th standard audience or even your postgraduate audience, most of them will not be aware of this. There is no such thing as a voice vote in the Constitution of India. There is a division of vote. Yeah. You will find that a former Lok Sabha General Secretary has written in the Hindu and another has written, I think, in the Tribune, saying that the voice vote is a convention or a procedure introduced by government, not by law. It isn't there in the Constitution. When one party had, when there was overwhelming support for one issue, you had a convenience thing introduced by governments. I'm not going into whether that was right or wrong. The fact is, it has no basis in the Constitution. There is no provision for voice vote in the Constitution. And even that they were not sure of. So they suspended 8 members of parliament in the Rajya Sabha. And when they were out, uh, passed these laws by 20th of September. And uh, not only did they pass these laws, they passed 4 gigantically sweeping labor laws, so-called labor codes, which they simplified from 29 laws, fulfilling the wish list of industry, big business, and factories. Okay. So now you need to ask the question, why were these laws so important to pass at the height of the pandemic, at the height of the lockdown, when government had 100 other priorities that were ahead of this? Mr. Modi's government had a majority as NDA in 2014 to 19. As BJP government, it has had a majority on its own between 2019 May and March end 2020, and it will still have that majority after the pandemic is brought under control, say in a year, for another 2 years. It could have brought these laws anytime between 2014 and March 2020. It could bring these laws after the pandemic is under control, but it chose to bring them at that time. What was the calculation? And you can see the calculation, how it was incited by the government's captive intellectuals and friends, many of whom wrote articles and op-eds, including Professor Gulati, that you have a 1991 moment This is when you can ram things through.
The liberalization movement.
Mr. Shekhar Gupta wrote, now he is changing his tune. I'm very glad. But he wrote that um, he wrote that this is never waste a good crisis. Badly paraphrasing Winston Churchill, I'm sure he doesn't know that. Probably he thinks it's his own coinage. But never waste a good crisis was what Mr. Gupta suggested. Mr. Um, Swaminathan Iyer of the Times, like he does on all such issues, says we need an iron fist, but in a velvet glove. Professor Gulati said there is a 1991 moment before you. Now, a government emboldened by this dug in and stood by its. Um, even this morning, even this morning, the Indian Express. See, the newspapers are more sophisticated than the television channels. They have 200 years behind them. Unlike the television channels, which simply wave the flag and shout rah, rah, rah for anything that the government wants. The new, newspapers try to take what they think is a more sophisticated line by saying, yeah, you know, this is a failure of the government. They didn't talk to these people properly. You know, as if these are a bunch of rustic yokels, dehatis who don't understand. All that needs to be done is that someone who's really expert should explain to them. The fact is, the farmers understand the laws because they understand farming much better than you and I do. Yeah, they may not articulate it with in sophisticated Angrezi, yeah, but they know damn well what it does to their livelihoods, which is the central issue. So the government then went ahead and banged these through. They banged these laws through at this time because they understood, in their understanding, the farmers and workers would be cowed down by COVID, paralyzed by the pandemic. They would not dare come and protest. How will they organize? And the farmers proved all these calculations were fatal miscalculations. Okay. So this is what we need to know about the protests. They have a context. Now, when the protest that you are talking about from September end, from September 25th, 26th, notice that every method has been tried to dislodge them and send them back home.
Yeah, actually, that was my next question. That is there an attempt to dilute and kill the whole protest itself? Like paramilitary
From,
forces are being employed, internet is being cut down. There's no power supply, no water supply. So
from day one, from day one, that has been the attitude. The method or the approaches have shifted. First was ignore them. These guys can't do anything. Then these guys refuse to be ignored. These guys, these girls, these women, these men refuse to be ignored. And I am saying there's another thing that you need to know for your 10th standard students and all students from 2018 March, which surprised people like me who have covered agriculture for decades in the field. There's been a growing sympathy for farmers as there is a realization of the serious injustice. Yeah. Thousands of students showed up to greet the farmers in Mumbai, again in Delhi. In Delhi, they not just showed up, in both places, students showed up with food packets, water packets, volunteers. In Delhi, students were having midterm exams in November. Yeah, they came out to the centers, to the railway stations, to Nizamuddin, elsewhere at 4:30 a.m. in the morning. These were first year students of first year undergraduate students came out there, received the farmers as volunteers, raced back to their exams at 10 o'clock, wrote their midterms or whatever tests they had, came back at 2 p.m. to participate in the lunch distribution counters as volunteers. I think this panics governments.
Yeah,
You
actually,
know,
you said that the government is not able to solve the problem because it is afraid, it's scared of the protests. I mean,
yeah, it is
yeah.
there.
Mm-hmm.
But it first, that was not the first reaction.
Mm-hmm.
They took it for granted that like anything that Mr. Modi bring will automatically pass and go through, and there will be no problem about it at all. And that was such a serious uh, error. So first was ignore, let it'll flip out.
Mm-hmm.
Then suddenly they have 2 lakh, they have a quarter of a million people on the capital's borders. Then they shift to the second tactic, good cop, bad cop.
Mm-hmm.
You know the good cop, bad cop tactic. Now, in the past NDA government, the good cop, bad cop tactic came from good cop was played by Mr. Vajpayee, bad cop by Mr. Advani. So they would both speak on the temple, one as a matter of compromise, persuasion, the other on we will bring down the Babri Masjid. You can see which prevailed. Fine. Good cop, bad cop. Here the roles have been reversed. In this government, there are no cops other than Mr. Modi and Mr. Shah. Okay, they had to create good cops. So they pulled Mr. Narendra Tomar. One of the great things about the farmers' agitation is that for the first time, this country realized that it has an agriculture minister and that he has a name.
Mm-hmm.
Where was he in all these discussions earlier? Because this country, a cabinet is a meaningless creature. It's 1.5 people. Anyway, the government. So then Mr. Modi played the bad cop by saying, never, it's a conspiracy, global, national, local, micro, maxi, etc. And Mr. Rajnath Singh and Mr. Narendra Tomar went out of their way to show, we're talking to the farmers, we're talking to the farmers. We are so reasonable, they are so stubborn. Shubham, if I pass a law condemning you to death, hmm, and without consulting you, nothing, without a hearing. And after the law is passed and you protest and you get significant traction on your protest, then I say, I'm willing to talk. You know, we can we can we can negotiate. We can negotiate whether it should be death by hanging or by firing squad. Hmm.
So,
But the basic law cannot be withdrawn. So this good cop, bad cop thing went on. The third tactic was in the good cop was the second subject as saying we are prepared to make many amendments. Now they at one point the government said the farmers are raising 15 objections. By the way, please note that none of these government proposals, they were all announced in the press. They were never made in writing, never given in writing to the farmers. We are willing to amend 13 of those 15 issues you've raised. We'll introduce amendments. Now, Shubham, if the government is admitting that 90% of the law could do with amendments, there is absolutely no sense in retaining this law. It is structurally, fundamentally flawed. So the second tactic was this, good cop, bad cop. Third was an all-out denigration, vilification, you know, criminalization of dissent. You are Khalistanis, you are this, you are that, anti-national, you're terrorist. I was in Singhu on the platform. The first thing that struck me when I was speaking I went there on the invitation of the farmers. One thing that struck me in the audience, the glinting. There was a lot of metal glinting. It came from 40, 50 veterans of the Indian Army who had fought and sacrificed in 4 wars for this country. The India-Pakistan War of 1965, Bangladesh liberation of 71, Sri Lanka in the 80s, um, Kargil 98, in between anti-insurgency operations in Punjab, And these are the people being maligned and vilified as Khalistanis. Between those 40, 50 people, they had 600 medals. In the People's Archive of Rural India, we did just five. We interviewed five or six. Between them, they had more than 60 medals. For what? For strutting about in uniforms? No, for putting their lives on the line for the defense of your country. How utterly cruel and insensitive it is to tar these people like that. In fact, at one point it got so bad that Defense Minister Rajnath Singh, realizing that this is creating a serious problem, issued a public statement saying, please don't do this. His party colleagues, his cabinet colleagues simply ignored it, and it is still going. The fourth tactic was to say, uh, this is only Punjab and Haryana, and pit Punjab versus Haryana. Oh, what about distribution of water, etc. And pit region, state versus state, people versus people, Punjabi versus Haryanvi, Jat versus non-Jat, religion, religion, region, uh, Sikh versus Hindu. Yeah. And within Punjab region versus region, the Maja farmers versus Malwa, whatever. That was the fourth tactic. The fifth tactic is just building a kind of astonishing, you know, prisoner of war camp almost, the kind of barricades and, as you said, paramilitary forces, creating conditions that, to my mind, are setting up extremely serious health hazards for which there will be very serious consequences to face. So this is the gamut of what has happened with the protests.